Hey everybody, this is P. Turner, executive producer and host of the Break It Down show. This week we are featuring a series of shows that talk about advising people overseas, especially for military people. Specifically, folks who are going to go through the MATA, the Military Advisor Training Academy, or who are going to work in an SFAB, a Security Forces Advisor Brigade. So these people are going to go abroad overseas from the U.S. to our partnered countries and try to create capacity, whether it's shooting weapons or patrolling or governing or running an organization in terms of military. So the idea behind these shows is to take these partnering skills that a lot of my friends and I have and give them to these folks so they can get an idea of what the elements are. Each show is going to present a different element and facets thereof. Each show also covers the cultural aspects that you'll encounter as someone who's in an advisor position. Today's show starts off the week and gets us going with Bill Mankins, who's been on the show before. You guys should check out his episodes. They'll be in the show notes. Bill is an international scholar. He's a double PhD candidate at the moment and about to be a double doctor. He's very soon defending. He is going to talk about how the organization and how the individual identify who could be a good advisor. What are the basic things that you need to do in terms of training and to identify how do you run one of these organizations? And this is what he's studying with his double PhD. His bona fides is rock solid. He has worked overseas quite a bit. He is a linguist in several languages. He is a master with culture. And he is someone that, regardless of you in the military or not, you can learn a lot from as you look at things from the strategic all the way to the ground truth level. You're going to love what Bill is talking about. Now, if you love what we do here, even if it's this military stuff and you're not interested in it, you will find useful nuggets in this show. I want you to support the show by going to YouTube and finding the Break It Down show, which is my channel, and just subscribing. That will enable you to hear every time we put a show out. And that, for us, is a big, big thing. If you're in the military and you're listening and you want to engage, there's a lot more of this content available to you. I can guide you towards other episodes. Everybody should be checking this out. If you're going to go overseas and partner with anybody, if you're going to work across countries or across company boundaries or intra-company boundaries, even if you're not in the military, these shows will help you better understand how to develop trust and work with people who you don't know or who have cross purposes of your own. Hey, here comes my man, Bill Mankins. You're going to love him.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
This is Bill Mankins, and you're listening to the Break It Down show.
This is an interesting set of episodes that we're doing. We're putting together something for a symposium for the SFAB folks, which are a military unit. It's a new unit in the United States Army, and the idea is they'll do a lot of the advising and assisting and teaching and training and free up the traditional Army units, the Army units, the CAV units, all to go do their armor, CAV, artillery things, infantry things, and really develop a professional advising corps as we go out and engage with our foreign partners. So that's the premise of this. And what we're doing is we're putting together the 5 critical elements of an SFAB and how to identify these people, what skills they need, and we're going to cover facets of each skill. Today's element is the identification of what an SFAB soldier is. Personally, to become a pro, and then at the unit level, how do you identify someone coming in who has the potential to become or is already a pro? And with that, we have Bill here, and Bill is look, we're going to get into Bill's credentials right now, but Bill is about to complete a double PhD. Basically, he is the world-leading expert on this type of thing because he's writing the papers and defending his dissertations and going to start an academy to develop these kind of special skills. So, Bill, thank you for coming on. What are your thoughts on this project?
Well, thanks for having me, Pete. Again, it's always fun. I mean, it's an incredible idea, the SFAB idea. And I'll tell you, the idea of having, basically a professional cadre that's designed to equipped and recruited and trained and focused on working and developing partner armies makes a heck of a lot of sense. I mean, just conceptually. like a lot of things that make a lot of sense. The devil's in the details about how well it works and the execution and the like. But it's phenomenal and highly needed skill set.
So let's talk about your background a little bit, because one of the things, and we've talked about this, so we're just kind of catching the audience up. One of the things about this type of work is there's not a long tab, there's not a trident, you don't just say the words delta. You have to create a bona fides. And I thought we might spend a little bit of time talking about your background and how you got to this point to be an internationally known expert in how to do this type of work.
Well, it's a very long story, so we'll put it the short version for now. And that's this. And my background was typical high school kid. I went to college, played football for a little bit, ended up having a blow on the shoulder. I'm trying to figure out what I was going to do with the rest of my life. The military was the greatest, closest thing to teams and brotherhood and mission and strategy and all those kind of fun things that the regular world just doesn't have. So that was my general direction. And then I went around and looked and said, what do I want to do? And just tried to find the most interesting, hard thing there was to do. And I went and talked to all the recruiters. And the SEAL option with the Navy was clearly the way I wanted to go. I was a big water guy and teaching diving stuff for years. I was teaching diving actually in Turks and Caicos when 9/11 happened, and I knew I was going in, but that was kind of a hurry up. So I went and did that. Ended up having a horrific multiple fracture femur and buds. As awesome as that place was amazing actually, and the people there were phenomenal and really took care of me. So I had a huge intel background that was a lot of training that was available to me. So I had studied Chinese and whatnot as an undergraduate. I got a master's degree before I enlisted to go be a frog. And yeah, when I broke my leg, due to having an intel as an IS, an intel skill set, they gave me an opportunity to go do some of the training schools that you would normally not get to do unless you were already a SEAL. So I was really fortunate and blessed by the community for allowing me to do some of those things that just were not the normal progression. And then finally, the big Navy stepped in and booted me out and said, you're meted out. And so, it's funny how I came to have an interesting combination of skills was an accident. So yeah, I had a bachelor's and I had a master's and spoke Chinese and had traveled around the world and stuff a lot. Knew how to fly airplane and dive and do all kinds of fun things that I had pursued on my own. And the military gave me all the intel sort of background and training, despite being broken femur with the buds scenario. And so then when I was forced out, I went back to school, fully intending to go back in the Navy once I healed, even if it took a couple of years. So I came to Indiana University because it was a place where you could study foreign languages and area studies and all the stands that don't exist anywhere else really in the country at that time. There's some more places now. My healing took longer than I thought and ended up basically getting most of the way done with a PhD course before I was, healed. I basically got an opportunity to go the Army organization that contacted me the same way they contacted you to go do human collection and cultural stuff and to basically be that bridge. And so that was the gist of how I got where I got. It was an accident. Once I went and did whatnot in Afghanistan on the human side and helping brigade and battalion commanders understand the full intel picture, not just the sort of bad guy targeting. So the full spectrum and how that integrates into a much bigger picture. And that was big. And for me, it was a language thing. I'd done the PhD stuff. And so 3 languages were required. So I had to learn, Pashto was one of the languages I learned. So when I was in Afghanistan, it was great to be able to, communicate with local people and talk straight up. At the same time, there was multiple times when I, would still use interpreters and still, we're talking high level stuff. You need an interpreter. Anyway, that's the skill set about where I came and how I got to kind of the present. And it was after that, I'll just add this, it was after that I came back after working off and on for 3 years in Afghanistan advising brigades. And that was in 2009, 10, and 11 that I decided to do a second PhD in higher education to address PME, professional military education, and looking at how the military in general educates itself. So kind of overall J7 training education issues.
And then, so you spent a lot of time on your own attached to units and watching and talking and listening. Give us an example of what either good or bad advising looked like from when you saw it. Because for folks that don't know, we got to go out and see units perform. And in my case, I know specifically, I evaluated our actions as often as I evaluate, actually probably more often than the other way. Because if we weren't, it's akin to shooting targets, and I'm talking to the audience now. If you've got an NCO laying on the ground next to an E3 trying to teach them how to shoot, now not hitting the target, well, the target would be the Afghans in this case, and we can't even hit them because our practices are not in alignment. And so how do you tweak that? Hey, 3 down, 2 up, let's adjust your windage. All these different things, you actually can make a difference if you know to start to look for that. So a lot of what I did focused on that. So taking that perspective, Bill, what did you see that worked well or didn't work well, or both if you have 2 stories?
Yeah, let me give me about a half a second to think what would be really useful. So, in general, define advising, because this can be broad. In our situation, we had a lot of different kinds of advisors there. For example, representatives who are working with and through people and helping brigades. So, for example, there's a State Department representative and a agricultural rep, and some kind of people that weren't necessarily doing military advising, but they were advising. And then there were people that were doing kind of intelligence advising with very particular skill sets of, how drones or how to do different kinds of surveillance stuff. For overall grand picture, I gotta be honest, there were just very few people doing that. And what I will call low-level strategy or high-level operations kind of reality building, so that everyone's in the same understanding of what's going on around them, consensus building on reality. So an example would be, we had, here's an easy one of a screw up. So we're in Kunar province. This is 2000 and we'll just say that time period. I won't say the particular unit, but it was 2009 to 11. This is conventional infantry unit, and that owned was managing a base there, and they were playing Rawhide, like the song Rawhide, on a PA system. The wee hours of the morning, just rocking it through the entire valley. Right now, there are 2 parts of this, right? So there's the fun sort of like door kicker part of me. It's like, oh, hell yeah, let's project our presence here and let everyone know that we are here, right? There's that kind of aspect of it. It's also kind of funny because, you're playing this thing and it's ridiculous when you think about it.
Yes.
And it's kind of good for internal morale, which is the purpose of what it was, right? The reason why the Sergeant Major was doing this was because he wanted to create morale internally for his guys, and it was effective. However, the other part of that was you're also, imagine if someone was playing like the most annoying Call to Prayer or like Gangnam Style or some other foreign sounding music that was just odd to you at 5 o'clock in the morning, blaring it over your peaceful valley. Should that happen in rural Kentucky with a bunch of Chinese music, would go crazy and be super pissed off, and for good reason, right? So those kind of things are examples of no one else in the advising group there, the team of advisors that were there to help that brigade, thought to try to rectify that. And that's obviously seriously problematic. Yeah. So I had to talk with them, had to rectify that situation. So I guess in one story there, maybe there's 2 of the things of advising that went poorly, which is not advising about it, and the things that went well, which was trying to fix it. And that ultimately the brigade, receptive, they changed. And the people actually were around were like saying, hey, thanks for cutting that out. I mean, it's small, but it's significant.
Yeah, well, I mean, and the advising and capacity building part is a complex job. There's a lot of factors. Yes, you need internal, esprit de corps, but also you don't want to get yourself blown up or incite violence or diminish your external rapport because of the internal things. It's a tough balance, and I get it. Like you, like it's hilarious to establish your dominance and play rawhide, and just be a big, hard to move beast that won't move, that you have to deal with. But it does make the delicate work of the day-to-day conversations more challenging, and they're already, get this, Bill, they're already really hard.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
What did you see that was good? What's a good thing that you saw, like some tools that you picked up or developed along the way?
So, well, in terms of observing, like in practice in the field, I would say this, the Marine ETTs, I thought so it's what are you advising on, right? And those guys were advising on tactical training. And I thought they were, the ones that I interacted with in Kunar were amazing. Those guys were spot on. But just did incredibly well, and had a really good ability to build rapport with, in a funny way, to build rapport with local soldiers. So I think, sometimes on two ends, right, this culture thing can go and not be paid attention to enough, and it can be assumed that people are so different when some things about humanity are very, universal. And the kinds of people who go become soldiers are pretty much the kind, unless it's a draft or they're dictated to, but the kinds of people who volunteer to be soldiers are roughly the same personality of people all around the world. And their humor tends to be a little bit more crass. There's certain things that just tend to go with that kind of group. And so, while you got to be culturally astute and not do certain things, the challenge is knowing which things and which things not. And I was impressed with the Marine ETTs because they did a really good job of not only knowing their craft, of course, the technical part and the tactics, but the capacity to build rapport with the local Afghans and laugh and joke with them. I mean, they would sit and, oh man, some of the late night campfire jokes that are standard amongst soldiers of, like girls and adventure and the same things and fast cars that are exciting for everyone who's, 16 to 30 and male. Like, this is pretty basic. And those things latch on or useful everywhere. And they were great at it.
So let's talk about identifying what an SFAB soldier could be or should be. Like, how do you look around that pool? I mean, you take volunteers coming in, but you have a screening process, but this is a unique job. And I think you and I would say it's maybe among the hardest things you can do in the military service because there just isn't a lot of dedicated doctrine. I mean, you're sort of forced to invent your own way of doing this, and we don't have the institutional knowledge yet. We want to say that we do, but let's be honest, you and I have seen too many units come through, and it's just not there. And I want to paint this part of the picture. Think about pre-deployment training to go in and do a job. Like if you're an artilleryman and you're a lieutenant and that's what you've trained the last 5 years to go do, you get to deploy and your job is now to sit across from an Iraqi general and try to advise them. And you've had minutes in comparison, hours of training that aren't even necessarily on topic. And you're supposed to perform in your, from minute 1 all the way through until month 12 or however long you're there for. And it's just an unrealistic expectation, which makes this transformation into a professional SFAB very difficult because there's a lot of ways to do this right and wrong, and they're often the same way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I would just say this. SFAB, what problem is it designed to solve? And I'm not 100% clear exactly to the level of detail that I would like what that is. And I think part of that's just because it's new, and so it's evolving, and therefore the purpose is evolving. There was a general realization of, hey, we need people to train foreign people, and so let's get a cadre together that can kind of be focused on that. But that's so general that you can always be able to claim success or always be able to claim failure because you can always do something within that window. So is it designed for conventional military unit to train foreign counterpart units of exactly the same type and ilk. So, and then what kind of countries, right? Are we talking Western countries like Germany or other NATO countries? Skill set, so to speak. It's a whole different kind if you're talking about going to, say, Cambodia or Sao Tome Precept or some other, more different place. And the other is, what are you training in? Are you training, again, massive, sort of BCT size units and tactics, or are you training individual soldiers and just sort of like shoot, move, and communicate at a basic squad or platoon level? And I would argue that the kinds of skills that you need, no different than doing it here, are very different depending on, or have additional components to them depending on what they're doing.
Okay.
So I say all that to say it depends on the mission, and I'm not quite, I've seen it big everything from, hey, we're going to train any kind of foreign unit, to on the website it's saying, in terms of if there's a draft or some kind of massive increase, that they'll end up training our own forces in order to quickly expand as additional cadre here, for example. So if the goal then is we're going to create basically a professional training force, then the question becomes, with all this, with personnel and recruiting and everything else, is how do you get good teachers, and what makes a good teacher? And a good teacher is different sometimes than a good doer. And I think that's something, just as a basic point, that this isn't just the military, this is all walks of life, but organizations tend to not do this well, which is realize there's a very big difference between being great at something and being able to teach that thing. We've all had that teacher in school that might have been an absolute genius. In fact, oftentimes the best geniuses are the worst teachers because they didn't struggle with it and therefore don't know how to explain and articulate the material because they were always just like solid at it. So two statements. One, understanding the difference between being an expert and being a great teacher. And if you can get those in the same person, that's great. But usually they are not. They're two different things. And the second is, anything like this is a systematic thing where basically the recruiting system for how you get the people you want, the training things of how do you then get those people off the street up to speed in the things you want, the promotion system for how they're going to get promoted and how they're going to get compensated. Because you might get technical experts who are really good and need additional compensation, but rank wise, they might not get said promotion. Right. And then how do you recognize them via various, again, badging components, or how do you get recognized within this new kind of thing of being a teacher when you're not going to get combat time like other people? And the system has to be able to recognize that. Otherwise, people are going to lose people and lose motivation, and then it's not going to go well to retain good talent like any organization.
When you look at the skills required, what comes to mind in terms of, if Bill got a chance to say, yes, pass the minimum PT test, but really for reals, this is what we want. How important is language capacity? How important is, there's not a good SPY test, but you need that ability to have that conversation. So what's the gift of gab test? What are the things that you want to see?
There's a lot, but a couple things. One, you have to have the capacity, a desire, basically, to want to work with, in this case, foreign people. So if you're going to be a teacher of any kind, you got to actively have your passion be the development of people. And you have to get gratification and be intrinsically motivated by helping other people develop. And so if you don't have that, you could be a technical expert and a whiz bang and be the best there ever is at sniping or ballistics or whatever the task is. But if just being great at the thing is your motivation, then you'll just be an expert at the thing. You won't be a great teacher. And so for teaching, and in this case, teaching foreigners, you need two things. One is you need to have a passion and a desire to live with and among foreigners. And two, you need to have a desire to want to and get excited by and be motivated from developing people, period. If you don't have it, one of those is good, but neither is sufficient unless you have the combination. And there's other things on top of that, but those two are just absolutely huge. You could be a PT stud and you can be an excellent, again, badass door kicker. Great. So you're the greatest CAG guy that's ever lived in the world. But that doesn't mean you're a good teacher of it.
Right.
These are two very different things.
I would add a couple things to your list. And one of them is sort of an overarching thing, and that's a cultural capacity test for CQ.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. CQ's huge. Yep.
Right. And if we don't have a
agree.
capacity to understand CQ, then, and if we get stuck at EQ and that's all we know about, we have to have a professional capacity to test and measure and evaluate CQ. And the other thing is can you build trust based on a design? And that's done. Robin Dreek has written the book. He found the principles. I found them independently. And we talk all the time about the ability to reliably build trust with someone. And it's a different. So let's talk about that. The ability to build reliable trust.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
Well, trust is everything. So it doesn't matter what you're doing. If you have other people that you're trying to work with, much less through, they'll only do for you to the level of their trust. That is leadership 101. Mm-hmm. So if you're going to ask people to do something, they'll only do is what they trust you to do. And when there's pressure or intense situations, and a lot of times we're talking about training people in places where there's, the indigenous personnel will attack U.S. soldiers, in this case in Afghanistan and others. So that level of trust and constantly having to build it's, huge. And so there is definitely personality, I would say. So this is where it kind of gets debated, right, on how you identify or what are the things. But I would just say that the personality, there's certain things that are taught. There's certain things that can be taught. The degree to which certain things can be taught can vary. And there's some things that just really, like, different people have a kind of a top out at a certain level, and they can't get beyond that because their raw capacity doesn't go beyond that. And I would say this, I do think that there's to some degree, personality attributes and psychological profiles that lend themselves better to this than others. And I'm not talking about, and this is where a lot of these psych tests or whatnot, you see on the website, they got the screen, and I have no idea. So to be clear, I have no idea what that particular psychological assessment consists of.
Okay.
As a rule, though, so for example, before I went into Buzz, they had a basic screen to make sure you weren't effectively a serial killer. And it was like, did you burn dogs as a child? I mean, it's this kind of thing.
Yeah.
Well, two things. One, everybody knows the answer to that should be no.
Right.
So the test doesn't actually catch what it's supposed to catch per se.
Right.
And two, even if it just doesn't catch what it's supposed to test. And so the question here is, what are the attributes psychologically that make up the kind of person who can deal with foreigners and get trust and enjoys teaching other folks and really be good at CQ, the cultural intelligence. And there's definitely some proven, tested, attributes in that field. And that's a component of psychological assessments that's well-grounded in academia and theoretically.
Okay. And then when you talk about the ability to, okay, so let's back up. So in terms of trust, is it possible to build a systematic institutional way? Because, as a guy I learned this, like you said earlier, by making a lot of mistakes and watching mistakes and saying, don't do that, shut up more, pay attention to body language. Hey, how about this one, Bill? This is going to be crazy. When you want to meet with somebody, set an appointment with the person is important. Don't just show up unannounced and sit on the couch for 5 hours, right? Like, have these things. And that for me allowed me to exchange a little bit of low risk trust with them until we got to the point where I could ride around in their car safe as can be because I was protected by the culture around them and what they assured me with.
Yeah, I mean, I do think these things. So, for example, the body language one you mentioned, there's certain components of these things of building trust. So, you could break down, trust into its own components, which we could do later if you want. But, how someone's physiology telegraphs themselves, and then your capacity to respond to that and get them in a comfortable position is useful. It's useful for everything in life. And frankly, a lot of these things, ironically, are something that I think just humans should know and be taught and trained like everywhere, not just in these units. But, specific to them, the body language is one. There are certain things about just in general in CQ training and development of, and Dave Livermore does a lot of this stuff in his courses. The social distance, for example, how well, everything from a physical distance. So we've all gone to, well, maybe we haven't. You go to certain countries and there's lots of distance and space physically and orderly, and people are conditioned and trained to respond in that way. If you get really close to someone in a lot of other cultures, that social distance and physical distance, not just social, has different lengths. So when someone gets 3 inches from you in line and actually touches you in the United States, that's like a no-go. I mean, you're cramping my space. Yeah. What are you doing? You turn around, people would look at you. You do that in like Latin America, certain parts of Latin America, or certainly in Southeast Asia, it's like there's no sense of line, and people will just crowd in. And if there's a gap, someone will fill it. Even if that's a 3-inch gap, they'll fill it and cut in line. Basically, we would interpret it as cut in line. They would not think of it as cutting in line. They would think of it differently. So there's these things about distance, and that then we're not even talking about social space. That's just physical. That how people, if you want to think about it as axes or dimensions.
Hey, this is Pete A. Turner from Lions Rock Productions. We create podcasts around here, and if you, your brand, or your company want to figure out how to do a podcast, just talk to me. I'll give you the advice on the right gear, the best plan, and show you how to take a podcast that makes sense for you, that's sustainable, that's scalable, and fun. Hit me up at pete@breakitdownshow.com. Let me help. I want to hear about it.
If you want to think about it as axes or dimensions that all cultures have, there's these maybe 7 or 8 dimensions that if you understand those dimensions, you really begin to place your own on a spectrum and others on a spectrum. And then you realize how you want to interact. Like, is it okay or not to display emotion? And which emotions? Like, can some cultures, PDA is not, public affection is not a problem. Affection is an okay thing to display publicly. In others, it is absolutely not. And some, anger, if you lose your temper and you get upset, it's a sign of weakness as opposed to, being honest, right? Because you were not able to retain control of yourself, and control is the ultimate value. And so when you look at those, I do think there's things that we can absolutely, systematically train and evaluate to improve people's capacity on the training side. Simultaneously, I think there's some things on the certain people will, like anything in life, there's people have capacities. And even if we have a systematic structural training that's perfect, not all people are able to be trained, will have the same results after training. No different than physical conditioning, right? You have some natural bracketing limits that are different by different people. And then identifying those and saying what attributes do really, really well with this training and are really kind of attuned to it is key to efficiency. Otherwise, you're going to do this meat grinder thing, which is what, historically organizations have done, which is we let everybody come in, we just grind it through the meat grinder and we see who's left standing. Well, you can do that with some physical things in boot camp, but like this kind of stuff is financially and efficiently, like it's just not efficient to do it that way.
Yeah, well, and the combat environment, the AO doesn't tolerate it. You'll be combat ineffective, think you've won, and this has happened the last 15, 20 years, and walk away like thinking you're a champion, and because you never go back to see your failure, you're left with this perception of skill and quality, when in reality there's a bunch of people, because I've watched the people leave and think that they won. Here's our legacy, and literally watch the next unit piss on their legacy, And so let's caution the SFAB folks. Like, this is very, very hard. And if you're going to go in an area once, that's it. You build these relationships. It's probably advisable to go back. But let's stay in the cultural point for a minute, and then we're going to get on to the next little part here. In terms of understanding culture, what we do currently is try to seek to not offend. And we have the same training that we had 100 years ago, and it's simple things like don't use your left hand when you eat in a Arabic Islamic style country, which I asked about because that's how I learned. That's my CQs. I ask, And they're like, hey, we know that you're from America and you guys use utensils and that you don't care about that. So you do what you need to do. It doesn't bother us. I asked about Ramadan, like, should we be drinking in front of you guys? And the guy basically said, why don't we just do whiskey shots right now during the day during Ramadan? Because we don't give a damn about that around here. We like to. And so he proved the point to me that you can't out Iraq and Iraqi. You can't out Afghan and Afghan. So don't try to be them. And matter of fact, be yourself and then work to evolve to a place that's closer to them and use that path as a means of closing the gap between you and your partner. How did I do?
Yeah. I mean, I completely agree with you. As you say, you can't Iraq and Iraqi. Yeah. Asking is the key. And I think most places, I don't know, I can't think of a culture that I've been to where asking and inquiring doesn't get you points. Here's the thing. People can sense authenticity. Everybody can, right? And when you're authentically inquiring and wanting to be there and wanting to help people out, like that comes through and people will give you slack. And if you're asked, people are usually willing to give you a heads up on, what's the protocol or what you should be doing. Or like you say, in this case with the alcohol, there's there's a general thing of this is what we do, but this is what we believe, but here's how we actually do that can be different. And then on the converse side of that, there's things where, we in this culture can do that, but you cannot. Right. So the easy one to display for Americans to see with this is we all have things that the in-group's allowed to say that the other one's not. So, black rappers using the N-word in a lyric or amongst themselves, not acceptable, is acceptable. Someone else who's not a Black American saying that would be unacceptable. And so the in-group has an authority to do something and a capacity to do something that they don't allow the outsider to do, and in fact would take great offense to. So, asking what those things, what conditions can you do this? What conditions can you not do that? You got to learn that lay of the land. And that's the tricky part about we're learning about culture as opposed to a specific culture. Is useful, right? And I think both of them are useful, but the one is absolutely necessary, which is learning how to interact with any culture, which is learning how to understand and interact with difference, is a skill set in and of itself. And then that's a baseline. Like everyone should have that as core. And then it's a matter of, okay, how do you go with specific culture and learn about that one or dive super deep into that history or that politics or that, religious entity? That's the icing on the cake.
Right. But again, don't fall into the trap of out Senegaling a Senegalese. It's so I would commonly tell my interpreter, like, hey, I'm going to ask questions I know the answer to, but I'm asking them, tell me about Ramadan. And then my interpreter would look at me like, about Ramadan. I'm like, ask the question, because I'm trying to use what I know about the culture to my advantage, to be curious and get that person to, because once I say, hey, wait, I heard that was kind of a weak school, you're going to come back at me with an answer automatically. You're compelled to, because it's part of your culture.
Yeah.
And I don't think that, just for the record.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's talk about, and a lot of this stuff kind of bleeds right into what we're about to talk about. Let's talk about, I always say, I don't care if you're trans, I don't care if you're gay, I don't care if you're from the moon. Either if you're a pro or willing to become one, you can roll with me on a patrol. What is someone who's in an SFAB or who wants to be in an SFAB? What are some of the critical things you would want them to put together so that they're not just marketable to the military so that they can get the job, but so that they're proficient as they can be? Because I can tell you, all of the pre-combat training I ever had as a whole, and it's a lot of pre-combat training, I would say less than 15% of it was relevant to my day-to-day task.
Yeah. Isn't that so shocking? It's
Shocking.
So true.
Yeah.
You know what's funny about that? Let me even back up further. I would not have believed that to that degree. I would not have believed that until I was in combat in a war zone.
Yeah.
And seeing that on a daily basis, I would have assumed that the ratio and proportions would have been different. And I would have thought it would have been more like 50-50 as opposed to 90-10.
Right.
And a lot of those, that it would just be different. I'll leave it at that. So, what are the somebody before they got in or had this kind of job would be useful to acquire.
Or even if they're in, like, okay, I'm here. There's not a lot of doctrine, because let's be honest, there's not a lot of doctrine. There's a lot of training that exists, but how do I become a pro? What does a pro do? What do they have a command of?
Well, I mean, at the very base, you need to have a knowledge of what it is you're teaching. So that's a given. I'm not going to talk about that. So that we're talking about the capacity to communicate and interact. So I would say, God, this is so, where do I even begin?
We'll start small.
Right. So when you look at say, how do I interact with someone? How do I know what's going on? So you have a couple things. So you have your capacity to communicate with them verbally. So that's either through an interpreter or it's through direct speech if you know the actual language, or you communicate with your own body, right? And that largely some of that's kind of primal and it's the same everywhere. And some of that's culture specific where this gesture in this place means this and this one means that. But for the most part, it's universal. And then you've got your capacity to read the other person, again, their body language. And so in that communication, just there's ways and training blocks that can be done to help people communicate. That is to say, give the signs that you want to give physically and verbally through an interpreter or directly. And then there's things you can do on a reading standpoint to understand what the other is communicating verbally or physically. So interpreter operations would fall underneath kind of that, one of those frameworks, right? Body language would also fall under those kind of things for language training, but not just language training in a general sense, language training in terms of, and I don't mean linguistics in a purely like academic sense. I mean like an operational linguistics, a practical linguistics that is useful to understand relationships of like when an interpreter gives you this word, this may or may not mean the same thing, even though it's the same word. Understanding how interpreters are even trained to understand the limitations of using word for word translation, for example. So there's a couple just conceptual things that are useful in that communication domain. Another domain might be, for example, your capacity to interrogate. And I say interrogate meaning interrogative, to question, to extract information from an individual or an environment, to query what's going on. And then if I'm going to use an example here. So if a student's having trouble with learning how to do a geometric proof, they're not conceptually getting, for example, how to zero up. They don't understand arc, or they don't understand whatever it is. You can just sit there and redo the same thing over and over again. But if you explain it 100 times the same way, maybe they're going to get it. But you really understand what piece of this, as you break it down, are you having trouble with. And so the capacity to interact and extract and get someone to break down and move through the breakdown of where they're having trouble is key for learning and teaching the skill. But again, the patience that the local will have with you on that, I'll just add another thing here off the cuff, is the trust part. And so trust building is a huge component of this, and how you do it is a lot of times patience, and there's a whole block we go into on that, but that trust is often built, in fact, almost entirely built, no different than here. It's not, if you're teaching someone to shoot, on the range. It's taught in the evening or in the morning at the chow hall, somewhere else, when you're laughing and joke about something, you're developing some familiarity. You show you care about me. Now I want to listen to what you have to say. You're actually taking time out of your schedule above and beyond to show me what I'm not getting. These trust things are huge.
Yeah, I will now.
Especially when you're doing really dangerous things. I mean, it's one thing in a sense, right? When you're trusting, again, the algebra proof. Okay, if this clown doesn't want to do it, or I can go get my training somewhere else at the teacher. If I don't like this teacher, or they don't care about me, or they won't answer my questions, I can YouTube that stuff, right? At least today. But when someone's shooting a gun or throwing a grenade by your head, like that level of trust across culture is a big deal. We're going to go from sim rounds to live ammunition shoot here. Whoa.
Yeah, big deal.
Sure. trust.
So I'll put an anecdote in here to kind of illustrate that. I was in Iraq with another unit, and a lieutenant was going in, and we were going kind of later in the day, trying something different, and he was going to engage, and he had a list of things he needed to accomplish from his battalion commander. And we get there, and it's the Arab Cup, and they're playing soccer, and everybody there in the Iraqi army is watching. Because Iraq is playing, I don't know, UAE or somebody, right? And he's like, okay, hey, Mohammed, we need to get to work done. And I smack him, and I'm like, hey, why don't we watch this soccer game? Because it's, I know it seems shocking, but nobody in that room wanted to do work at that moment. You can compel that person to do work for sure, but isn't it better to sit there and maybe even take a longer time and watch a whole game, ask about the game, learn about Iraqi soccer, and make that day about that? Because too many times, and this is for the SFAB folks who are listening, I heard, and I know you all have thought and said this, my boss wants this. Fuck that. Don't do that. It's not about your boss. You have to work from the point of the person you are advising has a goal. You have to understand what their goals are. And if you don't, then you can't, doesn't matter what your boss wants. You won't accomplish it. There'll be so there's 3 negative outcomes from cultural interaction. And there's a positive one called collaboration. And there's 3 negative ones. One is incompetence, one is passive aggressive behavior, and one is corruption. If you see those 3 things, it's on you as the SFAB member to figure out why are you not aligning culturally. You don't understand their goals, and you don't understand their decision-making process. If you can think in that term, now you have a chance to do these things. They're not going to, they want to watch soccer. It's like coming to someone's house in the Super Bowl and saying, hey, let's go do work. But my Niners are playing. Oh, yeah. Anyhow, let's go do work. It's foolhardy. So we have to take this boss-driven, here's what we're doing today, and we have to get away from that if we're going to be really talented SFAB people. We have to say, today is a day when we build rapport, and that's still a win. They're all small wins, but if I can really build that trust where the person's like, hey, thanks for letting me watch the game. I know you have things you have to do for your commander. Let's get those done now. Then that's the golden path, because now that person is going to run with you on a path that's much more comfortable than just compelling them to do something.
Yeah. I love that. I love the soccer example. I mean, it's spot on. There's so many times when, you could relate this to dating or anything else, right? Where you're trying to develop a relationship effectively with a group of people to gain trust. And in order to do that, sometimes you've got to go to the ballet that you don't really want to go listen. And by God, the Nutcracker, I hate this every year, but I do it because my partner likes it. And I know they like it. And I know they'll appreciate it if I do it. Right. And that's part of it. There's a million examples of that.
Yeah. And I guess, kind of the rule of thumb, the lens that I would want an SFAB person to develop is, am I the smartest person in this room? Okay, then I've got to figure out what I'm doing wrong. Am I the most important person in this room? Am I the only one getting what they want in this room? And if those 3 things at all are true, you need to stop, slow down, and reassess. Now, if your partner is coming to you for advice, like I knew I was doing my job well when the Iraqi general said, where is my advisor? I need to ask him about how to run my thing. And he asked for me by name. I became his advisor on, get this, Iraqi culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When you're advising an Iraqi on culture in their own country, you're doing it right, because you're trying to be the wisest person in the room, which means you have to shut up a lot, listen, ask questions, and not impose yourself. If you impose yourself, you will be absolutely obsolete within minutes, and you'll never know it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's absolutely right.
We've seen it too many times. And I should say, I want to soften this up a bit. We're saying this from experience, our own personal direct experience, that we've done this ourselves. And also we've seen what the training produces. And the training, we've done our best, but what we're trying to do is better now. And so the people that are taking on this impossible mission, it's delicate, it's deliberate, it's built on failure. Like that is how hard this stuff is. And you have to be, as an SFAB, tactician, you have to be willing to accept that today the win might be just going for a walk with your partner. Get them out of the office, reset their head, reset your head, and just get them to tell you stories or something, whatever it is. But you don't have to accomplish everything on the paper that day. Matter of fact, if you are, you're probably doing the wrong thing because, again, you're more important than what that moment needs. And you know, I'm a big believer in this, Bill, but affect is greater than effect. And if you can't take that, then spend time understanding why that's true, because you will absolutely be combat ineffective as an SFAB person if you cannot understand affect beats effect.
Yeah, it's vital. I noticed on that. I don't know if you're familiar with this. Well, let me ask you this. I noticed, because you may know this, if there's any people listening to this, I'm curious. So the issue was on recruiting. So on the website, it says, you have to already be in the military in order to go. So there's no pipeline right now, as I can see on the description, to take like the 18 X-ray, where, hey, so for a long time, SF was one of these things, Special Forces was one of these things where you had to be in and you had to go, be a minimum, I think, of V5, be in for a minimum, I think, of 5 years also before you could even begin to screen for Special Forces, because it was believed to be, advanced, which it is, and not only specialized, but advanced, which is the key distinction. And that, to a lot of people, didn't like it, but a lot of people did, where there was a pipeline that was created called 18 X-ray that allowed people to get a contract off the street if they met certain requirements, to have a direct opportunity to screen and go into the unit. One of the trade-offs is when you're looking, because what they basically said was, we're looking for a highly specialized person, and is there a way we can identify that person before that 5-year experience and attract them? Because there's a lot of people that, particularly in that community, would only want to go in the military if they were doing special operations. Like if you told me I had to go into the Navy for 4 years and then I could get a contract for BUDS, maybe, I would have said absolutely not. The risk reward is just not. It's no. Now, if you told me you may or may not, you may be stuck in the Navy if you fail or you quit, but I would no desire to serve in the Navy. I desire to be a SEAL. And those are two very different things. Think about it in this business sense. If someone said, hey, you can work at Google. Now, sign a contract to work 5 years at Google. Now, there's no guarantee you might be the janitor, or you might be the marketing guy, or you might be the coder over here on this particular project, or you may be cleaning toilets. Who knows? We'll see. Like that's nobody does. I mean, it would be crazy. So the idea in general of creating to if you want to attract it, if what you believe is a certain narrow person is attracted to this, and that kind of person isn't in the group as readily that's available, then you create a direct pipeline to try to attract that kind of person. And based off of what I see on the website, and this is only based off what I see, so keep that in mind. This could be completely wrong. But based off the current, as of today, Army website, it says you must be already in. SFAB units are open only to currently serving Army soldiers. I get why that started that way. It'll be interesting to see if it evolves to as they figure out the profile of person. I think there's a way to make that much more tailored and to make being directly, quickly bring in people who can, because look, you can send people to advanced shooting houses and do all kinds of things and get people tactically way up to speed very fast, right? These are skills that take development. Teaching, and if you want educators and you want people to be a teaching cadre, like that is, again, a very particular kind of person that I would argue. And people who make great teachers, which is what you're wanting here, are identifiable and could be fast-tracked and quickly got up to speed. I mean, it says they do the remedial training here and other stuff for like medicine and everything else. So everybody's already getting basically land nav and up to speed. So if you're already doing all of this retrain stuff, I mean, my gosh, if SF itself, Special Forces, can do it, SFAB can do it.
Yeah. Let me make a point here with this too, and I'm trying to be fair when I do this, but this illustrates the greater problem. Nearly every operator I've talked to has said this. There's one exception, and this is dozens of operators, including myself. We've all had more conversations in combat zones than we've fired bullets out of our gun.
Definitely.
And so when we look at that, we start to understand a couple of things, and I want you to expand on this once I'm done. I've never been asked to do a push-up in combat. I've never been asked to perform the 2-mile run or pull-ups, none of that stuff. The reason why I was excellent at what I did was that I was there a lot. I made a lot of mistakes. I watched other people make mistakes, and I outworked the problems that were in front of me. It had nothing to do with my physical capability. I had to push myself. I worked 16, 20-hour days all the time, but physical fitness testing has a very low correlation to what a good SFAB soldier might be. I'm not saying that you shouldn't meet a minimum standard. I'm not saying that being super fit is not a good quality, but it doesn't correlate well. And the other thing is if you were going to ask me what's more important, my ability to read a map or my ability to work an interpreter, fuck that map. I don't need to read. I don't need to do land nav course. I don't need any of that stuff.
Yeah.
In part because my ability to work an interpreter far exceeds the capability of holding an obsolete paper map in my hand. Now, do you need to have someone there that can read a map? Fine. It's like having a combat medic. You used to only need 1 or 2 in a unit and you'd be fine. Fine. Someone needs to have a backup plan of reading a map, but not everybody. So any hours spent doing that, you could trade that for the ability to work an interpreter. It's severe, but ask me how many times I had to read a map in a combat zone. It's none. Maybe I pulled a map out and showed an Iraqi who couldn't read a map, help me find something on a map, but that's not what you do land nav for. That's a different principle. What are your thoughts? Can you expand on that? And hey, if you disagree, that's fine too.
In general, I agree. I might disagree, but it only depends on the specificity of what's being done. So, for example, if you're training Moroccans to do land nav, then you need to know land nav, right? And be able to do it well. So it depends on what's being trained. And I guess this goes back to the question of the nature of actual mission of what they're doing and what's being trained. Meaning, what are we training others to do? And for the skill of teaching and training a foreign army or your foreign counterpart, the skill is actually teaching and training the unit. You're doing medical training and it's a component of that, then sure, you got to be proficient in that. If you're teaching people to work Modus, then that's what you need to be able to do. So if land nav is a component of the training curriculum that we're teaching foreign students, then it needs to be a bar that needs to be cleared. If it's not, then it's kind of I agree with you about the push-up thing and everything else. I mean, I'm a fitness fanatic. And absolutely love PT and all that kind of stuff. Always have. At the same time, unless you're scaling caving ladders and climbing ships and doing like very certain kinds of stuff, like you never really use most of it anyway. It's designed for something different, which goes back to my other statement about, what do you need and what are you measuring? And then what do you use for training? So for example, training attention to detail or identifying whether someone really wants to be there and evaluating someone's willpower. You're not actually evaluating their pull-ups or push-ups in this case, or their running capacity. What you're evaluating is their capacity to endure. And this is a tool in which to create pain to see how long someone can endure. But in and of itself, it's kind of, there's other ways you could do it too, right? We could have someone stand on their hands upside down and see how long they can take that. I mean, there's an infinite number of things you can come up with. So, the real thing is being, I would argue, is coming up with a matrix, so to speak, of what does someone need to do, actually do for this job. Then the question becomes, what kind of things we can do to measure that, and what's the unit of measure for that thing. And so I don't know. I might disagree with what you said, or I might not. Depends on what's being trained. I'm anxious to actually learn a little bit more because kind of some of this has been a little closed, and I'm anxious to learn a little more about the gritty details because that's where the rubber meets the road. Again, no different in the promotion issues and the recruiting and retention issues, and how the units are designed and mobilized and maintained. How the Army promotion works. If you don't, or military in general, like if you don't hit certain wickets, you don't advance. To give a parallel, for example, the Navy redid a thing several years ago because SEALs didn't have their own, the Navy's a rate. So it's MOS and other units. And so you had to, like, if I was a torpedo man, I had to maintain all of my torpedo man knowledge in order to make the next rank and take that annual test, even if I never touched a torpedo in my life because I was a SEAL. And eventually that became a big problem because guys couldn't advance, even though they're amazing, because they're basically, it's like, you know, if my job is air traffic control, but what I do over here is radar or some other totally torpedo man, like I can't maintain both of those very well, right? So they redesigned it. And I think that's something that's going to be interesting with the way the personnel system and all these systems integrate is, you know, how people will be evaluated and promoted when their core component is not, for example, is that going to be considered, you know, a deployment, or is it combat time? Is it going to be considered weighed the same way if someone's actually, you know, in a standard infantry unit versus in an SFAB when it comes to promotion? And will they move back and forth between the two, or do you become a specialized in that particular thing? So you're like a professional cadre versus not. You know, you're gonna once you develop and you do a couple of times of going abroad or 2 or 3 and training again, a Moroccan, you know, infantry battalion, and then the next thing you know, you're over doing the same thing in Indonesia, and then you're doing it in the Philippines, and you've now got 3 of these experiences. Do you rotate out and go to the regular infantry? And if you do, are you at the same place you did before? You stay in it. Okay.
Yeah.
So is there a way to leave? What happens if you get in there and you don't like it? Like, how does that work?
I don't know.
And are you penalized when you leave?
So they don't want to leave. We got to make sure they can have mustaches and beards and stuff.
Oh, geez. Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to clarify a little something. Yes, of course. Like if your job is shooting or land naving, I'm just talking about like our passion for land nav as a discriminator in leadership. In the Army, you go through your school and you have to do your land nav course, and those things are fine. You know, like it's just an example of we do this skill that we rarely ever, if ever, use in a practical sense. We test on it, and the ability to work a map, you know, of course, has a place. It's a very traditional military value. But if you're going to talk with an interpreter as the main part of your job in the most dangerous places on Earth, with the most complex environment, cross-culture, cross-international, cross-religion, cross all these multiple crosses, omni-crosses, then I want you to have every capacity you can to talk and to build trust and to grow a mustache and to figure out how to blend in no matter what country you find yourself in or what district you find. I mean, think about it. If you divided America into districts, you know, how different it would be place to place. We're talking about that. You need a person that can go into northeastern Maine, as far away as you can be from San Diego, and yet still go and converse in Lubbock, Texas, and make friends in a different language, in a different religion, in an area that's not permissive, all of those things. So yeah, map reading is important. Teach and train on it, but understand the mountain of stuff you have to master to be able to do SFAB work effectively.
Yeah. Do you know if there is a, I don't know, there's a training school for it. I know that, but is there a designator for it now?
I don't know what the final answer was.
Is it actually? It's become an MOS, like an 11 whatever Gulf or some other kind of.
I know you transitioned, so I imagine it is an MOS. I don't know the final answer on that. The last time I was talking to somebody about it was a while back, and I've got some interviews set up with some SFAB people, so I'll find out, but I don't know specifically. I want to ask you this so we can wrap this up.
Yeah.
If there was one book in the vein of what you're talking about in terms of making yourself a good SFAB warrior, what's one book that you would recommend?
The impossible question. Man, that's a really hard question. It's fun. It's funny. I'll tell you, there's a couple that it's hard to come up with one, but Dave Navarro's book on reading body language is phenomenal. He's an ex-FBI guy.
Dave Navarro plays guitar. Joe Navarro.
I'm sorry, Joe. Thank you. The Freudian slip. Yeah, Joe Navarro. Thank you.
Okay, so say that as your answer, and that's a perfect book. I love it.
Yeah, Joe Navarro has a great book on body language. He's a ex-FBI guy. There's Dave Livermore runs one book.
Here, I'm gonna say mine.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, look. So in terms of this kind of skill set to become a professional SFAB person, if you don't have a command of Robin Dreek's book it's called The Code of Trust, if you don't have a command of that material, I can't take you seriously as an SFAB warrior. You must have that capacity in your magazine of skills. It's essential. It's compulsory. Can I make this any more clear? You have to understand Robin Dreek's work on building trust.
Yeah, so there's many, but I'll just say one off the top of my head, and that's Joe Navarro's book on reading body language. He's an FBI intel guy, and it's a phenomenal book.
Yeah, I've read that book. You're right, and it changed how I saw body language. It doesn't mean that I'm a master at it, but I understand when there's incongruence, and it slows me down, and I look for what did I miss. It's a great book. I totally agree with you. I totally agree with you on that. Anything you want to say in closing?
I'm really just excited to see that it's encouraging that this got through. I mean, it's a pretty amazing thing when something like this gets through the bureaucracy. And so the idea that the Army stepped up and did it, I think is huge. I think it's going to be interesting to see how the military, the Army's new talent management system addresses this, because I think that's a key component of this, as they've completely revamped how they do talent acquisition and management as talent, as opposed to the traditional way it's been done, and how those two interface is going to be big. And then the last thing, I guess, to leave with is I'm really, really, really interested in how they're going to look on the front end of assessment and selection for the personnel there to match what it is they're actually doing. And how those advances get structured, again, through things like an 18 extra equivalent, for example, to bring people in the outside in ways that they compensate and deal with promotion internally. And in the schoolhouse, however that is, if it's going to be an actual separate MOS, or if it's an additional designator, like, again, an 18, I don't know, Mike, or something that they throw on the end to designate each a separate component for that. But those things have massive ramifications on the success of it. And so it's exciting to see this evolve.
Yeah, I'm excited about it too. And the reason why we're putting this together, just again, and I'll do a disclaimer up front, but I want everybody to understand, we don't mean to be critical. We mean to be helpful. We mean to be professional. And so when we say these things, we're coming from a place of experience and knowledge, and we're trying to help guide, like, these are some areas where you need to focus, because otherwise you're left to your own devices and you don't have the experience that we have, and we want to share that. So understand our intention is to illustrate some of these areas where these are critical things that you have to have a mastery of. And if you don't, you still have to have a mastery of it. So what happens? It's like being a mechanic and you don't know how to use a socket wrench. Or you can't, figure out metrics and standard measurements. You just have to have that knowledge if you're going to do that every day.
And on that, I guess the last thing I'll comment on there is the standards. So just, what if make a 5 level or 1 through 10, whatever it is, if to be an 11 Bravo to get out of this schoolhouse means you have to have this standard. So, everybody at the 11 Bravos, MOS has this, but then the difference between that and sort of your next tier can be huge.
Yeah.
Right. And what are those differences? And so to me, part of this is, okay, to use your example of the skill that can be done there, medical training, no different than the tactical training we do. There's different levels of skill. Do you make fast roping, for example, in our modern way of combat, part of the basic infantry training? In the ways that, for example, airborne training used to be super exotic, and now it's relatively integrated and common, or going through Ranger School, for example. At what point do you want the new basic to incorporate what? So what's going to be your baseline that everyone has? And I think with a lot of these things with SFAB, it's particularly interesting because they're talking about a lot of skills and skill sets. that those combinations are less common. And so figuring out what that baseline is going to be that you want the entire unit to have, and then what's going to be advanced, intermediate, and advanced SFAB training, because you have that full spectrum, and where you're going to draw the lines for how long the school is going to be, and what are we going to decide is good enough at the minimum. And I think that's a really important question, because I think it would be really easy to say, oh, a couple days in this, and could be so far below what the minimum should be that you're not getting anywhere. But then also the follow on, right? So if you've been in SFAB for, let's say, like no different than SF, right? Or any other thing, there's advanced schools that you have once you have the basics in that thing. But where are those lines? What's the bracketing going to be?
Well, listen, man, I appreciate you lending your expertise to this project. Hopefully the folks that listen who aren't SFAB people found it interesting. I know that what you do is important. How do folks find you? Are they Mankins Research, or where do they go?
Yeah, you can go to our website, mankinsresearch.org, or you can just email me at mankinsresearch.org. Find me on LinkedIn. You can find me pretty much anywhere.
All right. Thank you, man, so much.